Welcome, everyone, to the Good Leadership Podcast. My name is Charles Good, your host and the president of the Institute for Management Studies. My company has been developing exceptional leaders since 1974, and I'm so happy everyone is joining us for another great episode. This podcast is designed to provide you with actionable insights and strategies that you can apply, from discussing the research of esteemed leadership experts and practitioners to take your leadership to the next level. My goal is that what we discuss will be immediately actionable and useful to you. I am very privileged today to be joined by retired Colonel Dr. Sean Hanna, who is a renowned leadership expert. He has personal leadership experience in multiple combat and contingency operations. He's also published over 70 publications, is the editor-in-chief for a Journal of Leadership and Organizational Studies, and serves on the editorial board of 3 other top academic journals, while also being a professor of management at Wake Forest University School of Business.
Yeah, thank you, Charles. Appreciate that. Good to have you on the podcast.
So before we start today, I always like to just ask you a little bit about your background. If you could give our listeners a little more insight into your military background as well as your business background.
Sure, go ahead, Charles. I did spend most of my adult life in the military, 26 years in the Army, and retired as a full colonel back in 2012. So I just hit my 10-year mark after retiring from the military. I spent most of my career in the infantry. I had numerous, as you said, combat and contingency operations. Probably the most notable would be Operation Desert Storm. I fought the main attack element of that battle back quite a while ago when I was a young lieutenant. But I had a few combat and contingency operation deployments since. But I also just spent some time with the Pentagon doing large-scale financial management, and then became a West Point professor. So I spent my last 9 years of my career up at West Point, where I was the director of leadership and management programs, and then stood up an Army-wide center on behalf of the Chief of Staff of the Army, where we were responsible for character-based leader development across the entire active, reserve, and National Guard forces in the Army. So when I retired a decade ago, I came out of Wake Forest University, where I have a shared professorship here in our School of Business. And I've been focusing on business leadership ever since, and researching, studying, publishing that, and teaching in our MBA program here.
That's quite an impressive background. And once again, thank you for joining us today. And with that background, I'd love to know some of those best practices that you've identified in military leadership that really resonate equally well in business leadership. Is there 1 or 2 things that you've noticed from your experience that you see as really connecting well in both arenas?
Well, I think what I have largely found is that leadership is leadership. Leadership is a human endeavor. It's about human interactions and providing positive influence. In the Army defines leadership as the process of providing purpose, motivation, and direction to accomplish the mission while improving the organization. And if you listen to that definition, it's the same in business, right? Leaders execute a process. It's not a position. Leadership is an activity. It's a process. It's a human interaction that the result of that interaction is providing, again, purpose, motivation, and direction to the team to accomplish a given goal, objective, vision, whatever it might be. But again, while improving the organization. So always think about, how am I building the culture? How am I building the bench of other leaders? How am I establishing our ethos or building an effective high performance culture? Thinking about leadership long term like that. And it's the same in business. I don't really find any differences whatsoever. People often mistakenly equate power with leadership in the military, which is really not the case. Matter of fact, we have to operate in what's called VUCA, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous situations that cannot be controlled from the top. It requires organic adaptability down at the lowest levels. And so, matter of fact, I often share a lot of the core leadership tools and processes with business audiences. For example, leader's intent, which is a core concept in the military, where the leader lays out a clear vision for what needs to be achieved, the purpose, why are we doing this? Why is this important? Why should you care? Why are we putting time, energy, and resources into this? And then third, outline the key tasks. What are those 3 to 5 things that we've got to get done to accomplish that mission? And a piece of that The leader's intent philosophy underlying that is the leader is telling people what needs to be done and why it's important, but not how. And really engaging, empowering the team, giving them the ability to develop the how, the plan, and then come back and give the leader what's called in the military a back brief on what that plan is. And that's sort of that coaching touch point where the leader and follower sit down, go over the plan, maybe refine it. It's a very adapted, engaging leadership style. And we have to have that because you've got to have leaders at what we call the point of the spear out there making quick, rapid decisions and adapting to the context on the ground. So they need to be fully informed. They need to understand the big picture. They need to understand the bigger intent that the leader wants to see achieved. And then again, give them that sort of sandbox to play in, right? That empowerment box where they can make decisions that they need to rapidly adapt. And today's business environment, it's also VUCA. I mean, of course, with the latest activities going on with the COVID and some of the supply chain disruption and technology disruption and everything else, it's a constant VUCA world. And so this idea of leaders' intent and tools that we use to empower are really important. Some of the other tools in the military that resonate very well with business and are very applicable is some of the tools we use for learning, organizational learning, things like an after action review that is done after almost every important task or mission is done. And we sit down and say, all right, what was supposed to happen? What really did happen? What can we learn from what happened? And how can we use that information to get better? And it's just sort of part of that culture, that drumbeat of organizational learning consistently is a tool that's very effective also for business. I mean, I could go on and on. There's just a whole suite of leadership tools that the Army calls its leadership doctrine. And it's taught to every single leader in the entire Army. And so there's that consistency. And I've taught these tools to hundreds of companies, and they are immediately transferable to their environment to provide purpose, motivation, and direction, task clarity, and empower their teams.
That's great. And I agree with you that we're living in a VUCA environment, and this is an environment that the military's been in for forever, right? So we can have a lot of things that are transferable, that transfer easily over. And one of those tools, you went through a couple of great ones. One of those I'd like to unpack a little bit further, and that's red teaming. If you could just kind of give us an overview of that tool, and then how that transfers, or how a business, a leader could use that tool when making decisions, right? Exploring alternatives, opportunities, identifying weaknesses, so on and so forth.
Sure. Yeah, and I would invite your readers to can Google an article that I wrote for Chief Executive Magazine on red teaming. So if anybody just Google my name, red teaming, Chief Executive Magazine, an article will appear that gives some of the basic, blocking and tackling of red teaming. But red teaming is something that you do on the front end, right? So after action reviews are done after a particular task, although you might stop and do interim after action reviews in a longer project. The red team is something you do on the front end or plan, where we're trying to find all of the potential contingencies that might occur as you go to execute a given plan and foresee those, and then put contingency plans in place, checks and balances and other things to make sure that we can still accomplish the mission regardless of what might get thrown at us. But you probably heard the former Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, talking about known knowns, known unknowns, and unknown unknown. And that's really what we're trying to do during red team, is to really verify what do we know that we know, right? The facts that are available to us. But what are those things that we know we don't? The known unknowns that we've got to think about and create assumptions, right? You might know what your cost of capital is today, but you don't know what's going to be next week. You know what your supply chain flow through is today, but you don't know what it's going to be next week. So we make assumptions when we plan. And so when we're red teaming, we're challenging those assumptions. And we're saying, well, what if we were off? What if it's plus or minus 10%? Whatever it might be. And then there's the unknown, where we're brainstorming all those potential threats and opportunities that we might face. And that's a key point is, when you're red teaming, you're not just looking at what could go wrong, you're also looking at what could go right. So when I teach red teaming, I talk about, of course, Murphy's Law, right? If it can't go wrong, it will go wrong. And that's part of those unknown unknowns. We want to just brainstorm what are all those potential things that might happen. But we're also looking at those opportunities, that might arise. And so Murphy spelled backwards, right, is Unford's law, is kind of a term that I use sometimes, is if it can't go right, it will go. And we also in business need to be prepared to flex to opportunities. And so we want to identify those also. But red teaming is a standardized process. And in that article that I mentioned in Chief Executive Magazine, I go through some potential steps. There's all kinds of different techniques to red team, but ultimately you're just trying to identify key decision points that you might face as you go to execute a plan, where you might have to flex the plan. And then identify as part of that, well, what do the leaders need to know? So what information needs to be tracked and reported to leaders so that they know that those events are upcoming and they have the information that they need to make decisions when those events occur. And then again, potentially have contingency plans in your back pocket. And in the article, I talk about contingency we had executed in Operation Desert Storm, where we had to tell 150,000 soldiers spread out over about 100 miles wide, 200 miles deep to, instead of attacking to the north, basically make a right-hand turn, pivot in place. And you can imagine the complexity of an operation like that. We were reacting to conditions on the ground with the enemy, and we were able to accomplish that effectively because we had a contingency plan in place for that potential eventuality. So that's what red teaming basically is. It's really just to identify the known knowns and known unknowns, the unknown unknowns, Murphy's Law, Uniform's Law, identify what are those possible critical events, and then think through how the team would react if those events occur.
That's great. And in your article, you mentioned it could be done very formally or it can be done informally. And you can red team and you're really asking people to take off their hats, right? Of being the proponent, the champion, the advocate, and then to plan or put on a more critical, antagonistic, or adversarial or challenger hat just to see it from a different perspective.
Absolutely. And, if you have the time and resources to do so, it's also great to get other people to come in and look at the plan, right? Have external parties red team it. But you're right, it can be part of the culture. Once the red teaming concept is embraced by the culture, you can just be in the middle of a meeting and just ad hoc say, okay, hey, let's red team this thing. And again, as you said, it's basically telling everybody in the room, all right, look, we all created this plan. So of course we're proponents of it. I mean, by definition, you created the best possible plan that we can. So we think it's great, but let's maybe challenge that. Let's get on the balcony, get off the dance floor, kind of scrutinize a little bit our thinking and challenge ourselves and just make sure that we're doing the best we can to refine and improve the plan. So yeah, it can be done extremely informal.
Love that. I know that the military believes this to be true, and management and many leaders that I see that are coming up through the ranks. Some feel that a leader is born. The military has made countless number of great leaders, and I would advocate that there's only a certain small percentage of that total that's really genetic. The rest really, I think, is environmental. But I'd love to get your opinion on that. Is how much do you think of the 100% that a leader is really made versus born? I mean, is that genetic component 20%, 50%, 100%, or zero?
Yeah, Charles, that's something I've actually done some research on. Published a paper with Bruce Avolio from the University of Washington, one of the top, probably 2 or 3 leadership scholars in the world. And we analyze that exact issue because I don't think I do an executive education session where I don't get asked that question in some form, are leaders born versus made? And so we went back and looked through all of the research. A lot of it comes from genetics research, from twins. There's been a lot of twin studies that twins have been tracked over decades where they are looking at their emergence and development as leaders. And you can actually work out the equation to some extent because if you compare identical twins who have 100% identical genetic makeup to fraternal twins that have 50%, we can begin to tease out how much of development as a leader, comes from that genetic basis. Because these studies also look at how much of the twins' lives were shared experiences versus unique experiences. And so control for all that. Do they grow up in the same household? Do they both play sports, et cetera? And research shows that there's about 30% that is of leadership development and emergence as leaders in organizations is bound by something early in life. Now, I want to be a little bit careful about that because it's maybe not just genetics, although that's a critical component of it, but it also may be things that are so ingrained in the early years of life that they might appear to be genetic in nature. But I'm talking very early life experiences. So the good news is about 70% of leadership is developed over the lifespan through experiences. And we actually wrote an article about this that you can share with your readers. It lays out some of those experiences that do drive leadership development, those early life challenges, those trigger events where people stop and reflect on who they are and how they're influencing others, those early life experiences and challenges and setbacks and all of that. But some of the more genetic or you might say born elements are things like your personality. Obviously, people are born with different levels of energy. Some people just have more general energy than others, which make them want to seek relationships more and engage with others, which obviously helps as a leader. There's even research showing that physical appearance may have some influence on how people are perceived as leaders. And it's not necessarily all the heroic things that you might think, but even people with bigger foreheads, people tend to think that they might be smarter. There's this whole package of different factors that add up to about 30%. So yeah, I mean, I spent 9 years at West Point, and I'll tell you, I saw firsthand, young kids coming in at 18 years old out of high school. They leave 4 years later at 22 years old. It's just changed people that are ready to go out and immediately take over a 32-person platoon and take them into combat. And watching that transformational experience during those 4 years when you have a deliberate, propulsive leader development system that are putting people through those trigger events and challenges, but also giving them time for reflection and, support. You've probably heard the CAST model, challenge, assessment, and support. And to drive leader development, we've got to put people through challenges that are and make them stop and think and reflect on their performance and their impact on others, but also provide them feedback and assessment so they understand how well they did, because we're not very good judges of our own behaviors. And then provide that support in an environment where you get training, education, counseling, mentoring, all of that. You put those three things together, challenge assessment support, and you can really accelerate that 70% of the potentiality that we all have to become great leaders.
Well, that's great to hear. And I think that's great for our listeners to hear as well, because I always get that question as well from talking to different leaders in different positions to say, I just don't know how much of it's fixed. Can I even become a great leader? What does that look like? I love that paper that you referenced, and I'll make sure that it's available to our listeners. And in that paper, you also talk about parental influence that plays a key role, and how you stated that top rated leaders repeatedly describe their parents as being very challenging, pushing them as children to take positions seemingly well beyond their reach. And then looking at failure as a different way, as more of a learning event that they can then hopefully respond to as a result of that to the next leadership challenge more proficiently. So I think that's a great takeaway for our listeners as they're trying to develop that next generation of leaders, that they play a critical role, right?
Yep. The article that you're referring to, we talk about a theory that Bruce Avolio and I developed called developmental readiness, which is another component of all this, right? We put people through challenge assessment support, but they have to be developmentally ready and their organization has to be developmentally ready. At the organizational level, you have to have some freedom to fail, right? Leaders have to be able to underwrite the experiences of those that are developing underneath them and provide that coaching, that mentorship, and not punish them when things don't go right. As long as it's an honest mistake where effort was made, we're not doing anything, unethical or whatever. But the individual has to be developmentally ready too. And one of the key components that you're referring to is called learning goal orientation. There's learning goal orientation, there's performance goal orientation. So learning goal orientation is people look at opportunities as opportunities to learn, right? Not as challenges that I have to pass the test. And so when you have a learning orientation, if things don't go well and you have a setback and a failure, those people tend to stop and reflect on, okay, well, how can I get better? Because they see themselves as an evolving, ongoing, developing entity. Whereas people that have what's called performance goal orientation, they tend to think, well, I'm kind of a fixed entity, right? I'm an old dog. I can't learn new tricks. And so therefore everything to me in life is a test. And if I fail at something, well, I'm a failure because I don't feel that I can really get better. And those are the people that really stunt their growth, and that potentiality, it's that 70% that they could otherwise grow, they tend not to achieve the level of growth and development that they otherwise would if they had that learning orientation. Because they get defensive during failures, they don't take time to stop and reflect, they don't set new goals for themselves because again, they don't really think that they have the potential to develop and get better anyways.
You're right. And those are the same words that Carol Dweck uses in her book, Mindset, with the growth and the fixed mindset. Because you advocate that being a leader is really
Yeah.
a mindset, not a position, correct?
Well, it's a mindset, yes, but it's also an identity that you see yourself as somebody that has the capability of influencing others. It's also the motivation. Leadership is hard work. It's easier to be an individual contributor and not have to take on the additional responsibility of managing people and climates and cultures and everything else that entails. So we have to have that mindset that we want to do it. We see it as being important. We have an identity that we see that we can become a leader ourselves and we can build those skills and development. And then, of course, it is also KSAs. I mean, we got to build knowledge, skills, and abilities, to support the behaviors that are required to provide purpose, motivation, and direction to others. But it is certainly not a position. And I think the word leadership and leader is grossly misused in organizations. In the world I come from in the Army, you could be a commander, but that doesn't mean you're a leader. You don't get a choice on whether you're a leader. You cannot be appointed to a leadership position. You have to earn that right, that mantle of leadership, by showing that you have the ability to provide purpose, motivation, and direction. You've got the ability to build the team, the culture, the bench, and all of that. And that's when you have the right to call yourself a leader after others have called you a leader.
Great stuff. Love it. In every organization, there are these competing demands that leaders obviously every day must overcome to be effective to orchestrate collective effort. The leader must develop each individual to identify a common cause, and then where they need to make individual sacrifices short term for the betterment of the organization. But they must believe, right, that of the common cause and it's worthwhile. It's not something that's just not something they want to pursue. And research shows that this duty of orientation, right, which you speak about, is reflected in that. And you provide a great example of Nelson Mandela, how he held that duty of orientation and how he really, took it from where he's a great example of a leader who held such an external focus and that duty that changed his thinking about his role as a leader, transforming a system that was fraught with social or racial segregation and moving it into a more inclusive type culture.
Yeah, Nelson Mandela is a great case study to look at. Of course, in later of life, which people tend to focus on, he was this incredible transformational figure. But early, you talk about an identity shift and transformation. He started out as an armed mercenary. You might want to say the word terrorist. I mean, back fighting against the apartheid government and conducting military strikes against them, and sort of an insurgent operation inside the country. We could all make arguments back and forth about the honorability of those actions, but the reality was he transformed from trying to persuade people through force to becoming a transformational leader to try to inspire people to come together toward greater goals and objectives. And, if the listeners of this podcast have not watched a movie called Invictus, I highly recommend that you watch that film. I assigned it to my MBA students as a case study, and they applied leadership theories and concepts to that particular movie. And we spent hours unpacking it because it is so rich of a leader that truly is that inspirational, transformational leader that is able to pull together large organizations. And as you said, a lot of that is his own personal duty orientation, right? Which is a theory that I developed and gave a measure and assessment related to duty orientation that a team of scholars put together. But duty is not talked about enough in organizations. Some people almost think it's a quaint topic. When you use words like honor, duty, people immediately think of like military or something like that. But if you think about an organization where members of that organization don't have a sense of honor and duty, well, the entire institution begins to fall apart, right? Because it is those expectations and duties and fulfilling our roles to others that make social systems bond together. That includes strong organizations. We can't talk about things like organizational cohesion or trust or accountability without thinking about duty and honor, people fulfilling those things that they're expected to. And, that starts at the top. And that's where Nelson Mandela later in his life was a great example. He stayed in prison for a couple of decades voluntarily because offers to be released, he would have had to renounce his opposition to the apartheid government. He just said, I'm not doing it. I had this dedication to this broader vision that I want to achieve, and I'm not going to cave in for personal self-gain. And so he sacrificed himself and stayed in prison for a couple of decades until he was finally released and finally able to manifest his vision through peaceful political means, of course, rising to become the president of South Africa. And when he did that, everybody thought that there was going to be retribution. When he rose to power for the first time, everybody thought that Nelson Mandela was going to now make retribution against the former apartheid government and what would be the people of South Africa that had oppressed, his people for so long. And he decided to do the exact opposite. And that again, if you watch Invictus, I think it makes a fairly accurate portrayal of that, where he brought everybody together instead of trying to divide people and put them apart. And he made sure that he showed that personal leading by example and role modeling to everybody else, and that they understood how important it was to him and be that beacon of an example. So very transformational leader. I think it's a great case study to really study Nelson Mandela.
That's a great story and a great movie as well. I agree with you. So I do encourage also those that are listening to watch that movie. A great example of such transformational leadership by someone that brought a nation together that for a very long time had been at odds and been warring with one another. Another example, or let's kind of look at more personal leadership and how do you develop your leadership throughout your life? A lot of it's done probably disproportionately early in life because you're kind of more moldable then. But you also mentioned there are certain trigger moments that positively affect your leadership development. Can you go into some of those? Is there any structure around those? You mentioned some are kind of aha moments that might span decades that are just by chance or happenstance. Other ones are more deliberate through maybe coaches or mentors. But walk us through a little bit of that development, how it's formed early in life, if it is, and some of these trigger moments so that people can be more deliberate in trying to identify those or have those to improve their leadership.
Yeah, so you made a comment there, Charles, which is very accurate, that earlier in life we're perhaps more malleable. We don't quite have the development and maturity of development, particularly in skills of being a leader early in life. And so it's so much easier to have a whole bunch of aha moments because everything's new to you. And so earlier in life, we're much more likely to have those transformational experiences where we're learning something totally new or counterfactual to beliefs that we held, and they can change us quite rapidly. But there's also a lot of misinformation out there about the malleability of leaders later in life. And, again, I really encourage everyone to have that developmental readiness. I look back, like when I did my PhD, I was a lieutenant colonel when I graduated. So I was already a, fairly higher mid-level, officer in the Army at that point, and had led very large dynamic organizations through some very challenging experiences. And, I thought I was a pretty good leader. And when I went in my PhD, I was exposed to all kinds of new concepts and ways of thinking and theories that I had never even heard about before. And there's something called Worth's hypothesis you may have heard of, an early psychologist that basically argued, amongst many other things, that the brain is not able to think about things that we don't have a word for. And because the brain is a linguistic processor, largely, it's a conceptual processor. And so it's hard to have conversations and think about things in a very rich, deliberate manner if we don't have a rich bank of concepts and words to use to think about those concepts. And so as I was doing my PhD, light bulbs just kept going off. I was going back and reflecting on moments that I had even in the past. So these trigger moments can happen in the moment, but they can also happen perhaps even years later through reflection. When we look back at an experience and we look at it through a new lens and a new mindset and kind of have those aha reflections. So, when we talk about trigger events, they're really actually the experience of the trigger. And whether something that you go through is just an event or a trigger event is largely up to you as the individual. Do you take the time to reflect on that moment and say, okay, mini after action, right? What happened? What can I take from what happened? What does it mean? How can I get better? That sort of thing. And so leaders that have that sort of a psychologist called metacognition, the ability to think about our own thinking, right? And it's that ability to, even in the moment, you're in a meeting, let's say, and you just get yourself off the dance floor, get on the balcony, maybe look around, see how people are interacting with one another. See how the tone is in the room, the emotionality in the room. Think about when you make a leadership intervention, how do other people react? And it's a pondering, that reflecting, that considering of events around you and how it might inform your leadership is when it finally becomes a trigger event. But, obviously more extreme transformational events are those that are going to, more likely to jog you into that reflective moment and truly give you more of a counterfactual experience, or an experience that is just something novel enough that really makes you step back and reflect. And as you said, coaches, mentors, senior leaders can plan those trigger moments. I mentioned earlier challenge assessment and support. Well, those challenges are potential trigger moments, and we can design those for people as part of their deliberate leader development program.
No, I love all of that. I think that's great for the leaders that are listening to identify that they can have these metacognition. They can reflect back on their experiences through life that you can learn lots of great lessons from and develop yourself as a leader better. You can have metacognition where in the moment you're more introspective, thinking about how you're thinking and asking the right questions, right?
Yeah.
How is my leading right now? How are my values reflected in this action? Are my assignments, best at developing my followers, or am I just trying to do the job well? So it's asking those right questions, because a lot of what happens to us, our experiences every day and those big trigger events can really, we can learn valuable lessons from if we're in the right state.
Yep. Absolutely.
Well, we're almost done with the program today, but I always like to end with a call to action. Dr. Hannah, is there any one or two steps that leaders can take to increase value in the leadership areas that they're struggling with?
Boy, I tell you, there's so many potential lessons I could tell people, that are aha moments that came from trigger events that I've had throughout my almost 30 years of being a senior leader. I think, one of the biggest takeaways is leadership is a team sport. And I think that in many organizations, leaders look at leadership as being a position, as being about power. And the reality is that leadership is not something you do as much as something you create. And what you want is to utilize behaviors as a leader where leadership emerges, which means you're sharing leadership with others. And your job as a leader is not to have the answers. You might be, you honestly might be the smartest person in the room, although, in my case, that was pretty rare. But even if you are, you're never as smart as the room. And so, the combined intellect of the team. And so one of the biggest lessons learned throughout my career is just the more I can empower down, get other people's ideas, get their recommendations. Again, I mentioned leaders' intent earlier. other people figure out the how, then you choose from the best ideas and harness them. But I think that that's a real important, mantra for a leader is that it's a team sport. And I think the second is, as a leader, you should always think about every day, how am I making myself obsolete? Again, if we think of leadership as not being some mantle of power, we ought to be willing to give it away. And great organizations are those that identify people that have made themselves obsolete, and then they promote them to the next level and say, go make yourself obsolete again. And, those are the leaders that move up the chain and create this vortex of growth and development underneath them. Because by making themselves obsolete, they're building the team, they're building the processes and systems, they're building other leaders to take their place, they're building a culture underneath them that they become less and less important. So those would probably be my biggest suggestions to people, which kind of get to a mindset. Make yourself obsolete. Leadership is a team sport. And if you're thinking about those two things every day, you're probably going to be a pretty strong, empowering, inspirational leader.
Those are great. And I would love, if not to put you on the spot here, but if there's a personal story that you could share with our listeners, a trigger event to your leadership development that really would have impact. I find that all the time, that when leaders could hear from a great leader like yourself, something that really connects with them, it's just so much more impactful.
Yeah, I mean, I've had quite a few of them. In the infantry particularly, we get thrown into all kinds of experiences that we're just not necessarily trained for. There are missions that aren't even missions that are really in our doctrine to do. Got deployed over to Cuba for 6 months to be a camp commander of a migrant camp with thousands of Cuban migrants. And I had to be the mayor of this camp in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba for 6 months, for example. I'll tell you a little story about the Pentagon on 9/11, which, might highlight some of the points that I just said, particularly this idea that leadership is a team sport. So I was serving in the Pentagon on 9/11 when the plane hit, and I got a call after the attack to take over an organization that had the direct hit in the attack, a team called Resource Services Washington, that was responsible for billions of dollars of the headquarters Department of the Army budget. And this is essentially where the plane hit. They lost 84% of their employees. And I was asked to come in and take over as the budget director of this organization temporarily for a few months and stand it back up on its feet and recreate all of its processes and systems and close out the budget, which, by the way, the federal budget closes out at the end of September. So we had 19 days to reconstruct $32 billion, worth of the transactions that had been occurring throughout the year, and we closed this budget operation out. But I had an MBA at the time. I dabbled around a little bit with financial management up at the Pentagon, but nothing to this scale. And so when I walked into this organization the next day, there was two big lessons learned for me there. One is I stayed up all night the night before thinking about this engagement the next day. And what am I going to do when I stand up in front of the handful of survivors in this organization and try to turn the team around? And, I look back, you talk about a retroactive trigger moment, right? When I look back at it later, I realized I went into that meeting the next morning way too focused on management versus leadership. I'd spent the whole night before filling out reams of paper about all the stuff we had to do to reconstitute this organization. What I didn't think about enough was the human element. I didn't think enough about who did I need to be and how do I need to show up the next morning, when I stood this organization up. But, I was very thankful because I had the epiphany in the moment. And when I stood up in front of that group for the first time and was looking at their faces, something just triggered me, and I put all my paperwork down and I just asked them, what do you need from me? And they were silent. So I probed them again. What do you need from me? What can I do for you? And then voices started emerging from the room when they realized it was safe to do so. And, I really learned there that leadership is not something where you, again, are commanding and controlling and giving guidance to the team, but a great leader is giving the team what they need to be able to accomplish the mission for the greater organization. And you don't really know that unless you ask them. And, had I gone in and just said, hey, I'm, Johnny New Guy, and here's my, 58-point plan to turn this organization around, I couldn't even imagine how that would have fell on these people and what they would have thought of me, as the leader at that time. Would have shown that I didn't care about their emotions and their experiences. Another big takeaway there again was leadership as a team sport. I did not know how to do multi-billion-dollar, financial management operations, but I didn't know how to lead. I knew how to build teams. I knew how to strategize. I knew how to create social networks to bring in the knowledge and resources that this team needed. And once I got my head around what did they needed and where could I leverage my personal experience and relationships and knowledge, skills, and abilities, and what I could power down to them and let them lead and take charge of those things that they were capable of. It was a miraculous turnaround. We were able to successfully close out that budget in 19 days. But it was all because the leader before me had built the culture of empowerment. These folks were used to stepping up and leading. And David Lachek was the name of the gentleman who was killed in the attack. That was the budget director before me. He set it up such that after the attack, some of these people had to step up 2 or even 3 levels because their bosses were killed in the attack. And this team was able to successfully do that and, and accomplish the mission because he had that foresight. I told you earlier that leadership is not about just accomplishing the mission, but improving the organization. And David Lachek had really taken that mission on about thinking about the long-term type of organization, building that bench of leaders underneath him. And I was able to, enjoy the fruits of his work as that team was able to step up and make the mission happen.
Wow, such a great story. Thank you so much, Dr. Hanna, for joining me today. I think that story really sends us off on a high note and illustrates many of the principles that we discussed.
It was good to be with you today, Charles. Thank you for having me on your podcast.
Dr. Hanna, remind our listeners how they can get in contact with you.
Well, you can contact me through just Wake Forest University is probably the best. You just Google my name and Wake Forest University, and you can see some of my information on the site there and my email address if anybody would like to connect.
Very good. Thank you again for joining us today. And this concludes this episode of the Good Leadership Podcast. If you would like to access this podcast, it can be found on our website at ims-online.com for the Institute for Management Studies. Remember, until next time, it's not what you know, but what you do consistently that makes a difference.